Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society, move over, Marty McFly. It's time to let Link date your mom in high school. Boy, this is really expensive. So the Nintendo Cartridge Society expenses it for you. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I am joined, as I am always joined, by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great, but I feel like the end of the year is just barreling towards us.
Barreling, yes.
Feels like there's no time at all for those end of the year things you got to do.
That's right. You got to do things at the end of the year to get ready for the beginning of the year, and the beginning of the year has just loaded itself up into a Donkey Kong barrel.
It's ready to shoot out.
That's right. And we got to deal with that.
And it's what I think you were about to say. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think you're about to say it's one of those ones that's constantly moving. One of those Donkey Kong barrels changing the angle, and you got to figure out the right time to blast off.
It would be the worst if it's one of those barrels that's rotating the full 360.
Oh my gosh.
It's going up and down.
That is totally what the end of the year is like.
Or the beginning
or the beginning. Whatever one you said.
Closing in on us.
Whatever one you said is the one that it is.
Right.
And we all agree about that.
That's right. And they're all, look, it all adds up to not a lot of time to do a lot of things.
Exactly.
So what are we doing, Mark? We're spending some time talking about timelines.
I like that.
Okay.
It's true.
Right? It is true. And there's some of the same words. So it feels like it's a satisfying thing to declare. We'll get into that in a second. First, we just got to mention the Patreon, of course, patreon.com/Nintendo Cartridge Society. You can go over there if you would like to support us. If you would like to support us at the 8 or 16-bit levels, you get access to our once-a-month episodes of miniseries like NCS Arcade.
Yes, Patrick and I have been playing games available mostly on Nintendo Switch Online and Nintendo Switch Online Plus Expansion Pack. Mm-hmm. Mostly games that we've never beaten before.
I think entirely, right? I don't think we so far have played a game that we have beaten before, right?
Yeah, I guess I think that's true.
Right.
And the latest game we're going to be talking about is Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, originally released for the Game Boy Advance. Patrick has been playing the 3DS remake.
There you go.
And
plus Bowser's Minions, which I've not touched.
And we're going to be talking about it in just a
this weekend.
Few days.
Yes.
So head on over. We've talked about Minish Cap. We've talked about Jet
Mark
Force
going all the
Gemini.
way back to the first one.
We've talked about
Echo the Dolphin.
That's right. So many games.
We talked about Mega Man, Dr. Wily's Revenge, and Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy.
The original Metroid, Earthbound.
Yes.
We had a 3-hour conversation about Earthbound.
Right.
We cried multiple times.
I don't know. We did cry.
Anyways, you can check that out. There's also, a bunch of other miniseries and fun stuff over there. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and people who follow us for free. You can follow us for free on Patreon. If you're following us for free there, you get our listener feedback episodes. After each episode of NCS Arcade, Patrick and I respond to your emails about that game, and most of the time the series as well.
And so, ready your emails about Mario and Luigi as a franchise, but specifically Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, as that's the game that we are going to be discussing. And again, you do not need to be paying us anything to send us those emails or to listen to the episode in which we read those emails. Another thing you can do for free and is related to email is you can get into our Discord. Email us at Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com. And I will send you an invitation. It's invitation only, which makes it exclusive.
It's pretty elite.
Yeah, we're both doing a crappy little hand sign where we're it's like we're pinching it. It's so delicate.
Yes, exactly. It's like I'm lifting a doily off of it.
That's right. Which, of course, we do for the recording equipment before we get down to it.
Yep.
Every episode. All right, Mark. Let's get into it. Let's talk Zelda Timeline. Now, why would there be confusion about the timeline of a series of video games? Surely one thing happens and then another thing happens, and it's obvious what we're talking about.
Exactly. Case closed. Episode over.
Okay, so no, wait, hold on. That is profoundly not the case with The Legend of Zelda. And Mark, I would say you and we don't do like we're not like we will watch lore videos like that kind of stuff, especially when it comes to like Zelda or like Star Wars stuff. I think you and I both kind of like to go deep on that kind of thing, but that's never really how we have pursued like this show.
Right. I appreciate the lore. Like I really do. I enjoy watching lore videos and learning more about it because people make connections and understand things that like I never thought of or considered or noticed in games myself, but it's not something that I particularly it's not how I approach Zelda games.
Right. And I will also say that like um because we like to screw around a little bit on this show, so like approaching anything like as definitive as like lore or timeline stuff, we when we get loose, we get wrong. We get inaccurate.
Right.
And I don't expect us to be 100% accurate as we discuss the Zelda timelines here, but I do just kind of want to like float the idea or like the concept that I don't think you and I have ever like formally discussed the Zelda timeline.
I think that's 100% true.
And that is fascinating for like two guys that have done a Nintendo podcast for 8 years. That like whenever the timeline comes up, we're like, yeah.
Yeah, we do really kind of hand wave it away.
Yes.
Not that I don't think it's interesting or anything like that.
Yes.
It's just not something that we've really either of us really have a ton of like interest in.
Yeah, or it's kind of just like, yeah, I mean, it's this and then it's this and then it's this and then like, what do you say
That's,
about
like
it?
I said, case closed, episode over.
Case closed and we're done. And no one's confused. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to be like breaking down, examining the Zelda timeline and determining which branch. Because if you're not familiar with the Zelda timeline, and we will go through it all, we're going to determine which branch of the branching path is the best. What do we mean by best? We don't know. We're going to find that out as you find it out. And I think it's going to be a good time because, you and I have a whole timeline here to explore.
And the reason this is kind of top of mind for us is because The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom was released in September, and just recently, in the past week or so, Nintendo updated the official Zelda timeline to say where Echoes of Wisdom is in that timeline.
Right. And this is like the official front-facing timeline on like the Zelda website. A little background on the like origin of this like interconnecting timeline is that according to Miyamoto anyway in interviews, they have and have always had this like big interconnecting document that like says how the games are related to each other in time in terms of like cause and effect. And it wasn't really until they published the Hyrule Historia like art book several years ago where it was made clear what exactly the timeline is and that there are like multiple splits, or I guess one big split in the timeline.
Yeah, reportedly that Zelda timeline that existed in Nintendo's development teams for a long time. It was like a secret document that only Miyamoto and the game's directors would have access to.
Sure.
And reportedly part of that was because they didn't want the developers to be focused on story so much and trying,
Right.
all that
Yes.
aspect of it. Because not that, and I think this is where some of the confusion around the timeline comes from, where I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, the timeline is just something Nintendo made up. I, in fact, may have said this at some point, that the timeline is just something Nintendo made up to appease fans and not something that they actually like consider.
Sure.
But reportedly that is not true. And it's just not something
Yes.
that, as with all things Nintendo, they're more focused on gameplay being fun than the story of something.
Well, right. And I think even more than that, they are more concerned with the individual experience you're having with this game rather than how this game relates to other games, right? Zelda is one of the more story forward games in the Nintendo stable, but they're not like it's not a like complicated interconnected story, right? Like it's a rare case where it's the same link going from one game to the next. And in fact, I think we probably don't see that until like I don't know, Link's Awakening to the Oracle games, maybe.
Well, I think the first two games are the
Those
same
are
Link.
different Zelda or different Links, right?
I think they're the same Link,
Maybe they're
but
the same Link.
different Zeldas.
Yeah, it's definitely a different Zelda. Okay, so this is okay, and here we're already like getting things wrong. But so this is what we wanna talk about. What all of this is.
Yes.
Okay, so there is a branching. There's a point where the timeline it fractures, right?
Yep.
And do we want to talk about like? So it's all based on the ending of the Ocarina of Time.
Yeah, Ocarina of Time is really
It's the pivot point.
Yeah,
Yes.
the pivot point of the Zelda timeline.
And it's partially because there is that like the sort of time travel component to it, but there's also like another angle where it's like it's possibly canon that Link is defeated,
Yes, it has to be for one of the branches of the timeline to exist.
and arguably like the flagship branch,
Right, right.
that contains the original Legend of Zelda.
Yes.
So so yes, so the three timelines that kind of branch from there are if Link is defeated, which like just would mean the player hits a game over screen and doesn't
Yeah,
proceed any
Ganon
further.
kills him.
Ganon murders Link, or Link is murdered by an Octorok or something.
Right,
right?
he
Like,
falls off Epona and breaks his neck.
That's right.
But I think canonically, it's if Ganon kills him,
Sure.
then the hero's defeated. But but Hyrule continues. The world of Hyrule continues,
Right.
and these are the things that happen after that.
Right. So there's that, and then if you've never played Ocarina of Time, the sort of like hook of that game is that Link is a child for the first half of the game. Then he like travels to the future where he's grown up and fights Ganon and Ganondorf as an adult. Defeats Ganondorf. Zelda thanks him and sends him back to his childhood so he can have a childhood. Which means there are two separate timelines from that. One in which Link goes back to being a child, doesn't have to have like the rest of his adventure, and like has childhood adventures from there.
This is the one that this part of it breaks my brain
Right.
a little bit.
Because it means then that there's a version of the future where adult Link appeared, defeated Ganondorf, and then vanished.
Right.
Because Zelda sent him back. And so that is the third timeline, that there is an adult Link who was there, defeated, like Ganondorf rose to power, and he was defeated.
Yes. Yeah, so...
Oh, and I guess an important part of the child timeline is as a child, Link and Zelda go and inform the king, like, hey, this Ganondorf guy's no good, like, and then they shut him down.
Right.
Before he has an opportunity to, like, bust anything up.
Yes, so that's 3 forking points from
Yes.
Ocarina of Time. You have Link is super dead.
So dead.
And Hyrule continues on.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have Link is triumphant against Ganon.
And disappears.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But that's true in both of those. Oh, I guess not.
No,
see,
it's
that's
not.
the thing. But
yes.
See, this is where it breaks my brain a little bit, is because in the child timeline,
yes.
the one where adult Link was successful in Ocarina of Time, gets sent back in time.
So adult Link is successful in the future in both of those, in 2 of the 3 timelines.
Yes.
Right. But that's a different future that the child Link will never experience, because child Link and child Zelda told the king that Ganondorf was no good and they stop him from rising to power.
I know, but that's not actually possible, right? I mean, I know none of this is possible. I know.
Right.
Nobody has to worry about
yes.
my mental health. I understand that none of this is possible.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is, if child Link is adult Link, gets sent back in time,
yes,
and lives all of his childhood, but does he lose his memories of what happened? Like, how does how does the adult timeline continue to exist?
It just does without Link.
Right, but
because he's
but
removed
Child
from
Link
that.
got sent back in time. But did Child Link get sent back in time to after the events of
No, because Child Link and Child Zelda do something to stop the events of that like lead to the adult Link scenario,
right? So this is the part that doesn't add
which is why it's a split timeline,
in
right?
any I guess in any time travel story you just have to accept that.
Right, you reach a point because these things are like logical impossibilities, right?
Right.
Which is why like time travel so much fun, utter nonsense, right? um, so yeah, that's that we just have to like accept those things as true, and I think we understand them, but I don't. I also don't think this is not where the conversation starts because the Ocarina of Time is not the first game in the series, kind of by a long shot.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's also not the first game in the series to involve time travel. And there are no branching paths from any of the rest of these games,
Right.
which feels like here's a logical inconsistency.
Well, someday maybe.
Someday, maybe. Who
Maybe
knows?
they will
Yeah.
fork again in the future.
Or revealed to have been forked all along.
All along. Who
Uh,
knows where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are in all this?
I mean, honestly, who does indeed? No one, really. Okay. Let's back up and approach the beginning of the timeline in this first little stretch before it forks. Because the first game in the series is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, which, has the Skyloft, the island of Skyloft, like floating around in the sky, Link and Zelda. But the thing is, they also travel to the past, like 1,000 years before, or maybe it's even longer. And like battle back Demise, this ancient evil, that then sets off like this curse that Demise is going to return in one form or another. This force of evil, and Link and Zelda will rise to meet it in every generation.
Yeah,
that
every
happens.
generation. And this is the kind of like founding myth of
Yes,
Hyrule.
yes.
Because they are up in Skyloft, and then at the end of the game, they come down to Hyrule. And
Maybe spoilers for every Zelda game.
yeah.
Like, I don't really know.
No, that's true. We're probably
Right.
going to talk about spoilers for every Zelda game, but yes. So Skyward Sword is the first game in the Zelda timeline.
Yes. And kind of crazy that game comes around so late in like the franchises. It's like the 11th game or something like that.
Right.
And it tells the first story. From there, we move into the Minish Cap and Four Swords. This is all just this sort of stuff is building up the like legend of a mighty sword that will eventually take the shape of the Master Sword, right? Both the Four Sword and the Minish Sword like become this sword that is then like throughout the rest of the series the blade that Link has to wield.
And then these two games, Minish Cap and Four Swords, the villain in them is Vati. So Skyward Sword, the villain there is Demise, very Ganon-esque, but not
Very
Ganon.
Ganon-esque.
And so it's
right.
So in this part of like the Zelda timeline, Ganon has not appeared yet.
Right. Yeah, that is correct. And in Skyward Sword, we also have the villain Girahim, who feels a little bit Vati like to me. Every now and then there is this like sort of like mystic like effete character that is like dabbling in like the darkness. And usually they get bodied by the main villain.
Yeah,
who is Ganondorf?
What is the name of the one in Twilight Princess?
Oh yeah, what is the name of the one in Twilight Princess?
I shouldn't have asked because I don't know the answer.
His name is Zant.
Zant. There we
Look
go.
at that. I
there
got
we
it.
go.
Just right out. I didn't even look it up. Mark, attest to that, please.
It's true.
But yes, we Ganon and Ganondorf are like suspiciously absent from Minish Cap and Four Swords.
But then we get into Ocarina of Time.
And we already talked about how like that is the source of the branching paths, but this is also the first appearance of Ganondorf, right? Or canonically in the
Mm-hmm.
timeline, the first appearance of Ganondorf, who like by the end of that game transformed. Spoilers for all Zelda games. By the end of that game, becomes a like pig demon Ganon. You have to fight him that way and smash his tail with a hammer.
Right. So out
Uh,
of the 20 odd Zelda games
yes,
that exist, there's only 4 that don't exist in those Ocarina of Time branching timelines.
right. And Ocarina of Time is one of them.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom.
Well, we
We have to talk about that separately
yeah, yeah, yeah.
when we get to it.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the trunk of the timeline. I don't know if we want to consider that its own branch as we consider what is like the best branch of the timeline.
I feel like we're going to have to because there are some rock solid games in there
Yes.
that yeah, I don't know. We'll I tentative yes.
Tentative,
Tentative
yes.
yes.
Because otherwise, all the other branches also include them as well,
Oh, that's true.
right?
Yeah.
So which of the timelines, the fallen hero, the child timeline, or the adult timeline, which of these would you like to explore first?
Yeah, let's talk about the fallen hero.
Fallen hero, we already sort of said like arguably the like closest to being canon, weirdly. And some of that I feel like is from I does it feel like it's a Zelda thing that they like to start from a place of like desolation? They like to start from a place of like the world is destroyed.
Right.
And then like Link has something to like fight to rebuild, or even though you don't really do much rebuilding in any of these games.
Right.
Also, maybe that's just easier. You're making an 8-bit game where you're exploring a world. You can't have like houses and stuff.
Right.
So the first game in the Fallen Hero timeline is A Link to the Past on the Super NES. And I remember when this game came out and thinking, first of all, what's with the name of this game? There's no time travel in it. What is the Link to the Past? And it's like a meta joke about it being a prequel to the original Legend of Zelda.
Oh yeah, I've actually never really thought about that
Isn't
before.
that weird?
Yeah.
That yeah, then it's all about like saving the sages from like imprisonment after they that like Ganon imprisons them.
Right.
Moving on in the timeline.
We have our second example in like release order of a direct sequel. Same Link in Link's Awakening, going from A Link to the Past to Link's Awakening. Another kind of spin-off, like in the grand story of Zelda, like the Zelda series. And
Yes.
if we take Skyward Sword at its word that this whole thing is just about the repetition of the rise of evil and good meeting up, like rising up to meet it, Link's Awakening does not really feature into that saga at all.
Yes. I mean, not even abstractly, right? Like, Majora's Mask doesn't fit into that necessarily, but like you could say, like, oh, but there is like the evil in the form of the mask. It's just not the same evil that we see in the rest of these games. But yeah, like Link's Awakening is truly just like a weird thing that happens to Link, right? He winds up in the dream of a fish god, and he just has to like find a way to escape. That's the whole game. That's the whole story of the game. And I mean, I feel sort of similarly about the Oracle games, which are Link like finding his way to a temple and getting sucked into like an alternate dimension where he has to like just to fix the things that are wrong with those alternate dimensions.
Do you know what these
And those are all the same Links.
Yes.
Yes.
So what we're like these kind of like sub games where they don't necessarily involve Ganon, so
Yes.
they are not necessarily super important to the grand story of the Zelda series. It reminds me of how I think of the like Star Wars comics in relation to the movies, where we'll just say the 9 episode movies, those are the big tentpole releases that everything else orbits around, all the other canonical stories orbit around. But starting around the time of The Force Awakens, or maybe starting around the time of The Last Jedi, Marvel started.
It was before the Marvel was publishing comics before Force Awakens, like almost as soon as Disney bought.
Oh,
I believe the Star Wars line, written by Jason Aaron and drawn by John Cassidy, started in 2014, I
and
believe.
those, like they started by telling stories that were in between A New Hope and
Hmm.
Empire Strikes Back, right?
Yep, did that for a couple years, and then they started doing stories between Empire and Jedi,
And so it's like, okay,
and they've
well,
stopped that now.
if you never read those stories, it doesn't matter because those big
Right.
tentpole movies are the ones you need to pay attention to. It's almost a little bit like that
Yeah,
in
I think that's
the
yes.
Zelda timeline.
And like similarly, it like helps to in both those cases and in the case of like Link's Awakening is to just consider the like weight or value of the story itself instead of its place within the greater narrative, right? What does Link on Koholint Island have to do with him battling or him battling evil or his relationship to Zelda or anything like that? It doesn't.
Well, and I think this is kind of the perfect example of what we were talking about earlier with Nintendo being like, the timeline exists, but the timeline is not a very important feature of each of
Yes,
these
yes.
individual games because they're not trying to weave a larger narrative,
Right.
in the sense
This
that
isn't
it's
the
like
MCU.
exactly.
Yeah.
They yes, the stories do take place in this order, but it doesn't diminish Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages or Link's Awakening or Majora's Mask that they don't involve Ganon.
Right. Yes. And, also just sort of, again, by definition, that these games take place in a timeline where the player doesn't succeed at beating Ocarina of Time is like sort of mind boggling to be like, the assumption in this sort of like none of them are canon or exclusively canon, but in this timeline is that like the player loses.
Yeah.
Okay, so after the Oracle games, we get A Link Between Worlds, which takes place, very explicitly in the Hyrule of A Link to the Past, right? And it's hundreds of years later, so this is a different Link, and is very tied up in a sort of more evolved concept of what the Dark World is. And instead of just calling it the Dark World, there's now Low Rule as an opposite to Hyrule. And there are spoilers for every Zelda game, but there are analogs in Low Rule to the to Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf that are all like sort of opposite versions of like the Link from that world is not courageous, he is cowardly. The Zelda is not wise, she is foolish. That's Hilda and Rabio, respective or irrespectively. I switched them. But yeah, so there's it's. I think it's cool to see that like evolution of the Dark World concept along this one timeline, where we're going to be visiting the idea of a parallel Dark World in a different timeline.
Yes, that it's not exclusive to this timeline, that it's
Yeah,
something that even though Zelda or Link died in this one and in other timelines, he succeeded, that idea of parallel worlds is just something that exists throughout all the Zelda timelines is kind of cool to me.
yeah, I think
It's
so
like no
too.
matter what happens, there's these echo worlds out
Right.
there.
Yes. Which we will get to in just a second. But first, we got to talk about Triforce Heroes.
Which I think this one I really don't know for sure. I think the Link from A Link Between Worlds may be the same Link from Triforce Heroes, but I don't know that for
Ooh,
sure.
I mean, but there are three of them,
Yes.
so I
But I
don't.
can't remember how that happens in that
I
game.
can't. Yeah, I cannot
Why there
remember
are three of
how that
them.
happens either. I mean, it doesn't take place in Hyrule. It's in Hytopia.
Right.
Zelda's not present. Ganon's not present. So it definitely feels like a another like spin-off offshoot
Yeah, for sure.
kind of idea. And then Mark alluded to it already, but these sort of like echo worlds, obviously Echoes of Wisdom is the next placement in the timeline here, one that we just heard about recently, where Link now gets sealed away in a weird new space and you have to battle a thing called Null, which is the sort of like primordial ooze around which the Hylian goddesses created the world. That Null was a thing out there in space. I'm sorry, now I'm just like spoilers for every Zelda
Hey,
game.
spoilers for every Zelda game.
That in the like origin of the Zelda universe, there are the three gods that create the world, the laws to govern the world, and then the people to enact the laws of the world. And all of that was necessary because Null was just this thing that was like devouring anything that tried to be born into existence.
I went to church growing up. You're not telling me anything I don't already know.
So anyway, the Echo world is sort of like Null trying to like creep back into the world that is Hyrule.
That's cool. That's
yeah,
cool.
it is cool, and like is sort of like a further evolution of the Dark World, which like the Dark World is sometimes presented as like the sacred realm of the gods that has been like perverted in some way, and I think this idea of Null being a thing that was like exercised by the goddesses by creating the world, the laws, and the life, that it's cool that it would like try to seek its revenge,
Yeah.
and sort of like permeate the space between worlds. So that is that's how Echoes of Wisdom fits in there. And then something happens between Echoes of Wisdom and the original Legend of Zelda, which is the next game in this branch of the timeline.
Because once again, Hyrule's been desolated.
Just destroyed. Just like beaten down, and there's like nothing. People are living in caves, Mark.
Yep.
They're telling you to buy something, will you? Or they're telling you, what did we say today?
It's
Boy,
expensive.
this is expensive.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. They're telling you that kind of thing. You're buying stuff from moblins. It's a dire situation. And then that is followed by the Adventure of Link, Zelda 2, which involves another Zelda, like an older generation Zelda who's been asleep forever, and her prince brother who had a wizard boyfriend.
Yeah, wizard friend.
Yeah, roommate.
But it is the same Link.
It is the same.
It
Link.
is the same Link.
And that's as far as that timeline goes.
How interesting that those first two games
I know.
are just like so late
At the
in this
end,
branch of the timeline.
Yes, that's right. And at the end of like a weird timeline
It
that
is.
again necessitates the player fail.
Yeah, this will not necessarily be a criteria in which we determine which one of these is the best. But I do wonder, it would be a fun exercise to look at these and determine which of them would be the Hyrule you would want to live in. Because I don't think this branch is the one that I would want to live in.
I mean, we're gonna get to one where all of life is wiped out in a flood. So not all life, of course, but
most of it.
You would have to get up to like some mountaintops. I live in a valley, Mark.
That'd be not good for us.
No, it would be not good for either of us. Anything else to say about this? The hero has fallen timeline.
Not for the moment.
All right, so let's move on now to the child timeline. So again, this is Link is sent back in time to be at the Ocarina of Time. Link grows up, defeats Ganondorf, gets sent back in time, and then like he and Zelda as children are able to have Ganondorf arrested.
And this is just an itty bitty timeline.
It's an itty bitty time. Well, sorta. The next game in this timeline is Majora's Mask. Like presumably, Link is still a child. He has this encounter with the Skull Kid and the mask itself. Goes to a town, Termina, that gets destroyed every 3 days by the moon crashing into it.
Yep.
Again, this is a sort of side adventure that, well, it's hitting on a lot of the same themes of like Link battling an evil. He doesn't have like an ally in the form of like Zelda, and the evil isn't Ganon.
That's right. But that brings us to Twilight Princess. Many years after Majora's Mask. And this is the one I was talking about where it's like, yes, like these parallel worlds.
Yes, because we've got the Twilight Realm. I do just want to read for a second from the we're using the Zelda wiki as a guide here through the timelines, how they describe the child timeline. So the child timeline is a branch of the timeline that follows Link back in time after the end of Ocarina of Time. The legendary hero of time warns the royal family of Ganondorf's treachery, thus averting his rise to power and thwarting him from the start. There is a note. So Majora's Mask, as we just discussed, and then the failed execution of Ganondorf. I don't really know where this is from, but several years after Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf is sentenced to death. The sages attempt to carry out an execution, but Ganondorf survives, blessed with the Triforce of power by the gods.
Well, maybe that's from like the opening myth of Twilight Princess.
Yes, instead, the sages use the Mirror of Twilight to banish Ganondorf to the Twilight Realm, which had become inhabited by the Twilight descendants of the Interlopers. There's a hyperlink there. I'm going to click on that, figure out what that is. Interlopers, sorcerers of Twilight. We don't have time. We can't.
Maybe Zant is an interloper.
Maybe
I'm just speculating.
I think he's a Twilight for sure. But anyway, yeah. So that this is that how the story of Twilight Princess kicks off is Ganondorf trying to take over the Twilight Realm and then use that as an entryway into Hyrule proper.
Yep.
Where do we go from there, Mark?
After Twilight Princess is Four Swords Adventures. In this game, Ganondorf is reincarnated as the Demon King Ganon, and then Vadi shows up again.
Vadi's back.
Yeah, just get elbows out, trying to get himself back into the world, but ultimately defeated, and Ganon is sealed away again at the end of the game.
Very interesting that Four Swords and Four Swords Adventure are both appear on this timeline, but in like radically different places.
Yeah, and that Four Swords Adventure, which I think of as really having that Toon Link aesthetic from the Wind Waker,
right,
is not in the timeline with those other games.
Right. Yeah. Very strange. So that's the end of this timeline.
Yeah, it's short. Just
short.
3 games.
Just 3 games. And feels like there's like area left to be explored.
Yes, this one
somewhere.
feels like the least connected.
Yeah.
Like
right.
Each game really feels like it's doing its own thing.
Totally.
Whereas like in the Heroes Defeated timeline, it just feels like there's more like of a thematic thread through it, even though it it is like loose.
Yeah. That's that. But I mean, there's also just more of it there to like draw connections between things, and also like several games in a row that featured the same link, right? Whereas all of these, the Majora's Mask link is the same one from Ocarina of Time, but all the rest of these are different.
Yeah,
different links. Should we move on to the adult timeline?
Yes.
So this, what sets off Hyrule being submerged in water, Mark?
I don't know exactly.
So ages passed, and the Hero of Time faded into legend without the era of the hero. The seal of the Seven Sages ultimately broke. Ganon escaped from the Sacred Realm and used the Triforce of Power to bring darkness upon Hyrule once again. When no hero appeared, the king and his people pleaded to the gods for deliverance. The gods responded by bringing forth a deluge that would seal away all of Hyrule and Ganon with it. So the gods at this point, who are now being called upon directly because there's no hero to save the people of Hyrule, are like, fine, flood it, turn on the water. We are getting rid of everything and starting over.
Yeah, just a select few of you.
Yep.
We're letting you know. Go up to the mountain.
Who can get to the top of the mountain, you'll be fine.
Yep.
And so that is the setting, of course, for the Wind Waker and the Great Sea that covers most of the planet.
And that really kicks off the
planet. Should we be thinking about Hyrule as like a planet?
We know that there is world outside of Hyrule, right?
Sure.
Like
yes.
in Breath of the Wild, you go north and you can see that there's land on the other side.
Yes.
But you just can't get there. You can't pass that chasm.
Well, and we have to assume that like Hytopia is out there, Termina is out there.
Right.
Koholint Island, if the Windfish falls asleep again, maybe he'll dream that island again. Yeah, so I think we do have to assume, but I think all of that is flooded as well.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a real water world situation.
It's everyone's looking for dry land. Trying to stay away from the Mariner and his
Smokers?
Smokers, there we go. Then Wind Waker has a pretty obvious follow up in terms of the Phantom Hourglass, which this is the same Link.
Yes.
Same Link, same Zelda, who has like readopted her persona as Tetra, the pirate queen, or not even queen, but just like a pirate. Um, and they continue to have adventures together.
And then they found a new Hyrule, and then in the future, Spirit Tracks happens.
Right. Which includes the ghost. Is it the ghost of this Zelda or a ghost of a different Zelda?
I'm not sure.
Great. Great. Good. And that's the end of that timeline. Another
Oh
sort
yeah,
of
I guess another short one.
another short one. Mark, I'm so sorry. We have to go back to the child timeline and just acknowledge that after Twilight Princess, Link's crossbow training did, of course, take place.
Oh my gosh, what was previously the 5th best-selling Zelda game
Yeah,
in North America.
In North America,
Uh-huh.
yeah, now has been like wholly displaced. I'm sure.
Yes, by Tears of the Kingdom at the
Yes,
very least.
right. But in any event, so that's the sort of like end of that timeline, and then hundreds of thousands of years later, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom with its own time travel loop.
Maybe we don't know. It's in the official placement. It is like at the end, but after a bar. So
Yes.
it could be at the very end of the timeline. It could be anywhere. It makes sense to me that, but like the way what I was gonna say is that the way that it's placed is that it's not the end of any one of these specific timelines. It's just kind of like out there.
Right. So like the official line on it is that it is so far in the future that all of the like stories from the previous games have become myths, right? And you'll see evidence of this throughout Hyrule in both of those games, that there'll be like references to like Lon Lon Ranch is in there, right? And like Lon Lon Ranch exists in Ocarina of Time. And then also there's a Lon Lon Ranch in Twilight Princess too, I think.
I think so.
Which that's one of the timelines. But we also get a reference to Marin, who is a dream girl from Link's Awakening. So like,
well, and it seems to be in Tears of the Kingdom that we're, you know, Sonia and Rauru. It's not the original founding of Hyrule, not
right,
like not after Skyward Sword. It is maybe like a new founding of Hyrule in the thousands of years between the last game and when Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom take place, that maybe, that civilization stopped existing and then was refounded by the Zonai.
Right. Well, and it's also like very confusing too, because the Zonai like come down from the sky to found Hyrule, which is like sort of what happens in Skyward Sword with our characters. So like, is this just an example of like all of this has happened before and will happen again?
Or is this just an example of
Battlestar Galactica?
Of this being the Legend of Zelda, where maybe Skyward Sword is the start of one, like founding myth of Hyrule.
Yes.
And Rauru and Sonia is another founding myth.
Right.
And you could have a branch of games that come off of that one.
Absolutely. And obviously the Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity kind of fits before. Who knows? Both of all three of those games together have so many like weird time travel loops in them that like it's tough to consider them on any kind of timeline.
Yes, and I think for our purposes, and Nintendo doesn't right now. They're just kind of out there doing their own thing. We know that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are a pair. But otherwise, we have no information about where they fit into a timeline, the timeline, anything at all. And for the purpose of this conversation, I think we do not include them in determining which is the best branch.
Unless we think of it as its own branch.
Right.
Which I think is possible. And then there's the original Hyrule Warriors, which we're not going to talk about, because it is a dimension hopping, insanity laden thing where like they sure are like, oh yeah, no, this story makes sense, and you're like, no, don't tell me that, because it does not and should not. It's it's like Smash Brothers, but where all the characters are Zelda.
Right.
Okay, so we have now laid out uh, all of the games and where they fit on this like mega timeline. Mark, what do you consider a branch?
Hmm.
Now, I think the couple options are just the games after Ocarina of Time,
Right. And in that case, we'd be considering like the creation of Hyrule, that Skyward Sword piece of it, to be the trunk.
the trunk,
Uh
right?
huh.
And so we could either count those as part of each branch, which then sort of like negates them as like a considering factor into which one is best, or leave it off, right? So that's one slash maybe two ways of approaching it.
Well, I guess we could also consider it its own
We could also consider,
branch.
yes, we could consider the trunk its own branch, and then so that's a third option. And then I guess the fourth option would be well, any of these options then also have the variation where we include Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as their own, as like a separate branch,
Right.
which is maybe its own separate trunk of a different timeline.
Right.
So what do you want to do?
So I think ultimately all the four games, Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Ocarina of Time, those exist in all of them. So I
Yes.
don't think we can count it as its own branch.
Okay.
I think it has to be the trunk.
Okay, great.
Right? And so we can consider, if we want, we can consider those four games
As part of
as
all
part
three
of
of those
all of them.
timelines,
So,
yes.
like we were talking about the hero succeeds timelines, like child timeline and adult timeline, they don't have that many games in them. But
But
if
they
you
have these other,
include,
yes,
yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Which I said they sort of like would cancel each other out, but I think there's actually, because of the themes established in Ocarina of Time, about growing up and what you sacrifice when you grow up, that those themes may be reflected differently in the timelines that follow them, and maybe will, depending on what those games are, pay off those themes better,
Right.
which may act as like a bigger boost to the rest of that timeline.
So I think that we set aside Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom.
Right.
I think that we look at each of these three branching timelines, the ones that come
I think
out.
we look at each other. We promise to remain friends.
That's right.
Right.
And I wholeheartedly
Yep.
agree.
I agree.
But yeah, I think we just look at each of the three branching paths outside of Ocarina of Time and use those,
Right.
kind of pit those against each other.
So okay, I think there's I think the sort of like default answer, like the more obvious answer, is to say that the Hero is Fallen timeline, which includes the most games, including A Link to the Past, a game that we've heralded as maybe one of the best games ever made, Link's Awakening, the Oracle games, Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, Echoes of Wisdom, and the two NES Zelda games. That is like maybe the default assumption as like the best of these timelines, right? Or at least the most fleshed out.
Yeah, definitely the most fleshed out.
But how well do these games build on the idea? I mean, they sort of build on their own idea, right? Like we were talking about this concept of like the light world and the dark world, and how that evolves with Link Between Worlds and sort of explodes in Echoes of Wisdom. Um, that's a fun through line developed throughout that timeline, but I don't know that it necessarily feeds on the things established in the trunk.
Right. Especially, like those themes established in Ocarina of Time, like you were talking about.
Right.
The other thing that's kind of weird about this timeline so far is that, you have A Link to the Past, you have A Link Between Worlds, and then you have, I mean, there are other games in there as well, but kind of those
You get those
tentpole
side
games.
games, yeah.
You have A Link to the Past, you have A Link Between Worlds, then you have The Legend of Zelda and The Adventures of Link, The Adventure of Link. And if you are kind of like looking at those exclusively, I feel like what is being now set up in A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds, and then you get to The Legend of Zelda and Adventure of Link, and there's no real payoff in the finale.
Yeah, right. No, I agree with that, because Zelda 2 is like they're trying to resurrect Ganon, and when you die, he is resurrected, you know? Like, you're not really fighting to do good by the end there. You're just trying to prevent the world from ending again.
And there's none of that, which makes sense they were made first. But if you're looking at it as a
Yeah.
timeline and you're looking for the connective tissue, thematically, you have these parallel worlds in two of those tentpole games. Then you get to the end of it, and it becomes like the Rise of Skywalker, and you're like, what? This doesn't
Yeah.
pay off anything that was set up earlier.
Somehow Ganon returned.
Yeah.
All right, so obviously a bunch of great games in here, and just because it's not as thematically coherent with the trunk doesn't mean it's bad.
Yes.
But just worth pointing out, especially because we don't know what we mean when we say best, which
Right.
one is determining to be best. But let's examine the child timeline, where Link goes back in time and gets to live his childhood after experiencing a game that, again, is thematically about what you give up when you grow up.
Well, I do think we will need to go back and talk about that Heroes Defeated timeline and like the games in it,
Yeah.
as we figure out exactly what we mean. But since we're on the idea of themes
Okay,
and like
yeah.
following that through, I would say that the child timeline is the most scattered.
I will agree, but it is also like the darkest of these timelines, right? And the all the timelines involve like Hyrule being wiped out in one form or another, but like Majora's Mask, famously one of the darkest games in the franchise. But like just at its base is like Link experiences the end of the world over and over and over again.
And he's a child.
And all he can do is like try to make it a little bit better for people as they approach the end of the world.
Right.
And then one time save them.
Yeah.
And then you move on from that to Twilight Princess, which is like that's like a dark game. He spends a lot of that game turned into a wolf who's like chained up and is like scary, travels into a dark world that is like unrelenting and like and like you're helping Midna, who's this like strange imp lady who just keeps hitting you on the head.
And then there's Four Swords Adventures, which I can't really speak to.
Yeah, same. But Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, dark games, right?
Yeah.
And interesting that is like that is the continuation of the child timeline.
Right. But also childhood is traumatic and scary, and but I don't think that thematically it really pays off anything that is set up in Ocarina of Time, because it's like, what do you give up in childhood? And then Link goes back in time and is able to just live
is able to have childhood. Yeah. And in fact, the very concept of the child timeline seems to run counter to the thematics laid out in Ocarina of Time. Okay, so the adult timeline, where Hyrule continues with no Link because he vanished. We get Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. Now, this is interesting because Wind Waker is sort of like the quintessential like Batman Joker, we continue this dance forever over and over again, of like, even when you wipe out the world to destroy Ganon, he's gonna come back.
Yep.
So that feels pretty consistent with things laid out in Skyward Sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm not really sure. Oh, and you give up, this Link is expressly a child, right? In Wind Waker, has to leave his grandma. I guess they're all sort of, they have to leave someone, but like there is, because the grandma like lives and exists through the course of the game, and you have a sister, that it feels like there's that connection is like consistent.
Yeah, and this is another one where Link is expressly a child because he's approaching his coming of age.
Right.
At the start of the game. Yeah, I do think it's interesting that even though this forks off of the adult timeline,
yes,
this is in a lot of ways the most childish of the
because
of
the Toon Link aesthetic for sure. There's also the interesting connection of like Wind Waker is where we meet Zelda as a pirate, right? She's going by the name Tetra. She's an action princess, right? And she will remain an action princess in the sequel, Phantom Hourglass. And then she is active as a ghost in Spirit Tracks,
Yeah,
right?
it's true.
Which is like sort of evocative of the Zelda in Skyward Sword, right? Who is an active participant in like the story. And you and I have talked a lot about how the relationship between Link and Zelda in Skyward Sword is one of like that game's best features.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I mean, right now I'm like, in terms of thematics, it kind of feels like the adult timeline is winning out a
Yeah,
little bit
I
there.
agree with you.
Okay, so that's one criteria for best.
Another is we could talk about just the quality of the games
Sure.
in each timeline.
Right.
And in that case, you really do have some. You obviously have some heavy hitters in all of them. I would say, as far as consistency goes, the hero defeated timeline is less consistent than like the adult timeline.
It's also no 3D games.
Yeah,
It's all the 2D top down games.
that's right. Um,
But yeah, I mean, we mentioned that in terms of like the story, that there's more spin-off stuff in here, which I think also means like just generally some games that don't hit that hard, right?
but like you said, A Link to the Past, an all-timer,
Yep.
like A Link Between Worlds.
Another
Great.
another all-timer. I really enjoyed Echoes of Wisdom, but but I guess time will tell what like the consensus is on that game. But the original two Zeldas are also like at the end of that.
Yeah,
And Zelda 2, famously like one of the worst games in the series, I guess. No one likes it but me. I'm the only one.
But The Legend of Zelda, I mean, just foundational, groundbreaking.
Sure, absolutely.
Superlative after superlative.
So the child timeline, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Four Swords. Majora's Mask, a game that stresses me out, but I recognize the artistic value in it. And Twilight Princess, best dungeons in the franchise, a game that you and I both like quite a bit.
Yep. And then finally,
Four Swords we can't speak to.
Yeah, Four Swords we can't speak to. And then
Four Swords Adventures, sorry.
And then the adult timeline, again, Wind Waker, all-timer.
Yep.
But a compromised game.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. An incomplete game.
Yeah, one that really has, I think people have grown more fond of as time has passed, and the Toon Link aesthetic has just become another version of Link, and not the shock that it was when it was first revealed.
People were so mad when they thought this was the only thing Link would ever be again.
And then Phantom Hourglass, I mean, both, I would say Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks both have mixed reception.
Yes.
Phantom Hourglass probably more divisive than Spirit Tracks. I feel like, generally speaking, the mood is nicer around Spirit Tracks, even though I don't particularly share
Mark
that
famously
opinion.
doesn't really like Spirit Tracks.
But Phantom Hourglass I do really like, and I feel like that's the one that most people are sour on. So I would say like Wind Waker, the only clear standout from the adult timeline, but even that is a compromised game.
Yeah, so I think well, it may have taken the gold in thematics, it maybe takes the bronze in terms of like games, and then maybe the child timeline has like the best like pound for pound games, but the Hero Has Fallen timeline has the most games.
Yeah.
Which means they each have one gold.
Okay.
All right. So which of these is the best? Is there another criteria by which we can judge these things? Because like a volume of games is in everything.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, well, I was impressed with like when we broke down the themes running through them. I was impressed with the adult timeline. I feel like we got to push that one out. I feel like that is not in contention for the best timeline.
I think you're right. Because I think when you look at each of the individual games, they are just not the strongest in the series.
Right. Even though we love Wind Waker.
Yeah.
But Wind Waker's the strongest of the games in that timeline.
And it's a weird one.
And it's a weird one.
So yes, I think you're right. I think the adult timeline is out.
Kiss it on the forehead, tuck it in, and then throw the bed out into space.
Yep, that's right. We're shooting it from that Donkey Kong barrel.
That's right. Is that the sound a barrel makes when
It sounded right to me.
Okay, all right, good.
So that leaves us with the child timeline and the hero is fallen timeline. Fallen hero.
Right.
Whatever we want to call it. What are we going to call it? What are we settling on?
Okay, we're going to let's use the language adopted by the fallen hero timeline. Hero is fallen.
Fallen hero.
Fallen hero. Okay.
Fallen hero.
Okay. The game over timeline.
Yes.
The thing is, it's so hard to argue with the lineup of Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Oracle, Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, Echoes of Wisdom, Zelda 2.
Yeah. Check this out.
Yeah.
These are the only Zelda games in existence. All right. We live in a universe where these are the only Zelda games in existence.
Please.
Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, Four Swords, Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Oracle of Seasons and Ages, A Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, Echoes of Wisdom, The Legend of Zelda, The Adventures of Link.
Great games.
Uh-huh.
I love this. I do feel like I am missing the thing that's established in Skyward Sword and Ocarina,
which is the repetition of
there's like the repetition of the evil and the good to meet it, but also the like exploration of a 3D world and there's that gameplay thing that we never revisit in the Fallen Hero timeline.
And it is kind of hard. Again, it's like, oh, these are the only Zelda games in existence, and for the timeline to end in almost a regression to the Adventure of Link. Okay, so check this out. Now we live in a universe where the only Zelda games in existence
are... Close your eyes. Imagine this. Hold hands.
Skyward Sword, the Minish Cap, Four Swords, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Four Swords Adventures, which we can't speak to.
But we can speak to the fact that it is similar to Four Swords.
Right.
In some way, completes this loop with Vati. We get these two other 3D Zelda games with dungeons, and I don't know. I'm sort of feeling like the child timeline is it.
I think it might be. Because you do get a little bit of top-down Zelda with the Minish Cap and Four Swords. So you're getting a little taste of that.
And the Four Swords Adventure.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I feel like it's the representative. It's the one.
There's also something to the fact that, like we talked about, Ocarina of Time is kind of the linchpin of the Zelda series, not only the pivot point for the Zelda timeline. And so the fact that...
But it's the move to 3D as well.
It's the move to 3D, and then if we're following the child timeline, we're saying that's the best, that you are literally continuing that Link story in Majora's Mask.
Yes,
there's something nice
that's
to that
true.
as well.
That's the only one where you're continuing that Link story. Yeah, because in both the other two, Link ceases to exist.
Right.
Either through, being stabbed by a Skullfos or whatever, or just from being sent back in time.
Right. Yeah, the reason he doesn't exist in the adult timeline is because he's in the child timeline.
That's right. See, you do get it.
He can be taught.
So I think we're coming down on the side that the child timeline is the best branch of the timeline. Dare we consider if there was a branch that was just Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom? I don't know what we get out of considering this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let's talk it out though. Let's stub it out. So I think do you even consider the trunk games? Do you even consider Skyward Sword?
I don't think you
literally
can.
Those two.
I think it's literally those two.
So I do think it's a really tough comparison at that point because we've put so much value into Ocarina of Time, and we're basically saying,
and so much value into what the trunk establishes.
Yes, that we're basically saying that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom don't involve those at all. It's hard to even consider them in comparison.
Or it does, and the all the other branches are part of its trunk.
Right, but we just don't know that to be
We
true.
just don't know that to be true. We can't speak to it. I think we gotta put Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, kiss him on the forehead, put him in
tuck
bed,
him into bed, shoot it out of the DK cannon
right into space.
into space.
All right, so congratulations, Child Timeline.
Woo, you did it!
You are the best branch in the Zelda Timeline. Mark, let's close this out. All right, that is going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback or any thoughts about what your favorite branch of the Zelda timeline is, you can write to us at Nintendo Cartridge Society
At gmail.com.
or use that email address to get into our Discord. I will send you an invitation if only you ask for it. Thank you to our 16-bit patrons, Connor McKay, Patrice Millette, and Kyle Seaborn. We appreciate all of you. We appreciate everyone who is listening or engaging with us in any way. Anthony DeLuca made our logo. Our theme music is provided by 8-Bit Betty. You can get more of his music by going to 8bitbetty.com or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Ellers saying thank you for listening.